Hello, welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam show. I'm Bill Dixon, your host, part of the North Carolina Vietnam Veterans streaming live show. Tonight we're going to continue what we didn't finish last week, the contrast of the Vietnam War from the life that the soldiers who served in Vietnam, the men and women who served in Vietnam, as well as all aspects of the Vietnam War. You could have been in a base like Long Binh, which was almost, or Cam Ranh Bay, which was very similar to almost being like stateside. Starch uniforms, spit shine boots, saluting, and all that sort of stuff. Or you could be out on patrols where you patrol all night, search and destroy, and ambush all night. Excuse me. In daytime, you spend out on patrol. You sleep on the ground. Or you could have been in a fire base where you might have actually had a bunk to lay down in from time to time. The foods you ate could have been sea rations, or it could have been a regular hot meal, or anything in between. All kind of the different contrasts and so forth. I want to mention a couple things that are coming up, just so you know. If you're anywhere in the sound of my voice and can get to Raleigh, North Carolina, next Thursday night, and that's not tomorrow night, this is Wednesday, but not tomorrow night. It's March 15th at the North Carolina Museum of History on Eatonton Street. We're holding a symposium on post-traumatic stress to help you if you got post-traumatic stress, don't know whether you got post-traumatic stress, don't want to get post-traumatic stress, or want to get it treated. We're going to be talking about all those things next Thursday night from 7 to 9 o'clock at the North Carolina History Museum. And then on March 30th, we will be doing a special presentation of Silhouettes in Service. It's a young man who has taken 300 hours of interviews with veterans and has reduced it down to 90 minutes, and he does a fantastic one-man show for 90 minutes. He will keep you enthralled for 90 minutes. If you know some of the people he has interviewed and doing the show, he does them better than they do. Some of my friends are part of the people he's doing. It's fantastic. That's also at the North Carolina Museum of History on Eaton Street here in Raleigh from 7 to 9 o'clock. And then Friday, the big things start. April 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. We'll be doing the Vietnam experience there at the museum. We will have weapons display. We'll have uniforms, memorabilia. We'll have a 1/8 replica of the Vietnam Wall. We'll have a diorama of the tunnels of Cu Chi. We'll have helicopters, vehicles of all kinds there. We'll have a little bit of something for everybody at all from 9 o'clock Friday morning up until 7 o'clock Friday night, which will be doing the first production this year of Etchings in Stone, the fantastic play by Mr. Ron Harris, Vietnam vet, Wake Forest, North Carolina native. It's called Etchings in Stone, and the concept is you, the audience, are sitting inside the Vietnam Memorial Wall like it is in D.C., and what you see are people who walk up and visit the people whose names are on the wall. It's very poignant. It's moving. It's touching. It's a little bit of everything. There's a break as we go along as far as music and so forth of the ear to break things up. But it's quite a moving experience, and it will definitely change you. On Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, the same thing as Friday. The vehicles and so forth will be there on Saturday. It will not be there on Friday because of putting them in where we're going to have to stage them is not available until Saturday. But the vehicles and so forth will be there on Saturday, where all the other displays will be there Friday night. The play again starts at 7 o'clock and lasts about 9 o'clock. It's right at 2 hours. We're trying to cut it back a little bit back to an hour and a half, but right now it's about 2 hours. And then April 3rd, that Sunday, the play will come on at 2 o'clock. And the displays will be there for a while there also. Also, the March 29th at the Veterans Memorial on Harrison Avenue in Cary. There will be special Vietnam commemoration there by the City of Cary and the Daughters of the American Revolution, recognizing, honoring National Vietnam Veterans Day, which is officially March 29th. Our next show will be a show on Agent Orange and how to get claims taken care of for children, grandchildren, and veterans. Getting the claims for Agent Orange somewhat can be a change. So now, as we go into the show, I'd like to invite you, if you'd like, to call in 919-518-9773 and put your 10 cents worth in. If you come in and ask questions and make your own comments, it might even be $1 worth. That'd be great. We don't charge you a time to come in and do that. By the way, the Etching and Stone play is free. All you got to do is call 919-434-7345 and tell us which show you want to attend and how many tickets you need. Or now, if you're really technological, which most of you are going to be watching this show, you can come in on Skype at Computers 2K. That's 2K as in kilo, voice, and ask all kinds of questions and make comments and so forth. Now, our first slide here that we're showing tonight that was under construction when I left Long Bend. This was going to be the Chinese restaurant they were building there at Long Bend. It was next to the miniature golf course. As you can see, what I was talking about, the contrast as far as living conditions on where you were. Later on, Joe Harsh was at Long Bend in 70s, 71, I think, somewhere in that range. And it was called Loon Phone's Chinese Restaurant. So I never got to go into it, but that's what it looked like. Now, I'm going to jump the gun a little bit and go into other people who served in Vietnam. All Vietnam veterans did not ever set foot on the ground. You have those guys who in the Navy who served off the coast of Vietnam with their battleships who could shoot their guns to support the ground troops in Vietnam. And of course you had the aircraft carriers who had the planes who went in to support the troops as well as to bomb different places and so forth. And then you had the Vietnam vets who were stationed in maybe Thailand or someplace like that with the B-52 bombers who flew for a long, long day to fly into and drop their bombs on North Vietnam and so forth. One of the most awesome things in the world would be to be the recipient of a B-52 bombing run. You don't even know it's up there because it's so high, and next thing you know, the world is coming to an end because they're dropping those bombs. I can't imagine being in the tunnels and so forth. But that's some of the people who served in Vietnam without ever touching the shore. They are still considered Vietnam vets, quite often, especially with the aircraft guys that got shot down and so forth. Now, the United States government, the people who are running the war, have never been known for the most intelligent people in the world. So when they were going in to bomb North Vietnam, we bombed a lot of open fields and rice paddies and so forth. But when they were going in to bomb like Hanoi, they wanted to make sure that they didn't blow up any civilians in the process. So what they did was they kind of sneaked around and told the Swiss government that, hey, we're going to bomb Hanoi tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning, their time, and we're coming in from the west. And next thing you know, the Swiss people who are neutral are on the phone calling Hanoi going, well, okay, the Americans are coming in tomorrow to bomb Hanoi. They're coming in from the west, and they'll be here at 9 o'clock. Now, the idea was, and the United States knew they were doing that, but the idea was that the communist government was going to go tell their people, because they don't want to get their people killed. They wanted to go tell their people, hey, you may not want to be there during the day. You may want to do this. But see, in real life, they didn't, because that would mess up their propaganda machine. They love to show injured women and children and old men as the bombs dropped. So they didn't share that information with their people. They did make bomb shelters right there on the street. So if you're walking down the streets of Hanoi, you pull up almost like a manhole cover and get down inside for the bombs. But see, they knew exactly when the Americans were coming, what time they were coming, and from the direction they were coming, and that advanced information created a new problem. That new problem was the anti-aircraft guns. Now, you could be a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun operator, and you go, well, let's see now. I can get myself a little bowl of rice here and have some tea, and because Americans won't be here until 9 o'clock, and they're coming in from the west, so I don't have to worry about it. I just got to be at my gun by 8:45 to be ready for them. Which is one of the reasons we lost so many pilots and having airplanes shot down, was the anti-aircraft guns knew that we were coming, what time we were coming, because we told them. It's a great way to fight a war. And of course, now they also had celebrities working their anti-aircraft guns. If you notice there, that's the infamous Miss Jane Fonda, the #1 daughter of Henry Fonda, who's just one of the greatest actors we had during his time. There she is sitting in an anti-aircraft gun in Hanoi. And her comment was that when she was sitting there, she was waiting for the blonde-haired, blue-eyed murderers. That can't be anybody but the Americans that she was waiting for to shoot down. That's one of the pictures that she now says that she's sorry she had made. But she had it made either way, so that's how you look at it. So another problem we had was the SAM missiles. The SAM missiles and their radar. And if you notice right there, they put them in the neighborhoods where the civilians were. So it was hard for the planes to come in earlier, the fighter planes to come in earlier and bomb the SAM sites because, again, the communists would use the propaganda of going, look how many women and children they're bombing. So we lost a lot of planes shot down due to they knew when we were coming, they knew the direction we were coming from, they knew what time we were coming. All they had to do was lock their radar on just long enough to get the plane. See, if they kept their radar on so that you could see when we were coming, then our planes could lock on their radio and they could shoot our missiles directly at their radar, follow their radar right down and blow up the SAM missiles. But since they knew when we were coming and where we were coming from, they only had to turn their radar on for a brief moment to get the idea of where the plane was so they couldn't follow it back to them. Isn't war a wonderful thing when you have these different rules of engagement? As you can see from the next picture, we bombed a lot of rice paddies and empty fields because we were very limited through the rules of engagement, what we could bomb, when we could bomb, and how we could bomb it, and so forth. So makes nice swimming pools and so forth. See that nice, pretty blue water and so forth. But as far as doing any damage, if you notice in the picture there isn't a whole lot of damage done to anything except for the field. It might be a little bit rough to plow and plant rice in that field, but other than that, there isn't a whole lot of damage there. So that's some of the contrasts I was talking about of other wars. If you look back at World War II, where we did mass bombings of villages and towns and so forth, and then in Vietnam, so we wouldn't have that problem of civilians getting injured, we told them we were coming. I don't think we did that in World War II. Now, we've been talking about Long Binh and the comparisons and so forth of where it was safe and wasn't safe. Well, let me tell you something. If you were in Vietnam, there were no safe places. If you notice this next picture, there's it's not that barracks there was not finished and built. That's where the 122 millimeter rocket that the Vietnamese communists fired into 90-foot placement there at Long Binh. Now, Long Binh had 55,000 troops. It was just like being back at some of the local bases here in the United States, except for there was no safe place. No matter where you were, if you were back in the field, out in the field, or back at the base, you really had to realize that you were 24/7, something could happen to you. And this was one of the examples where the rocket hit. This is where the soldiers who are coming in the country came into waiting to be reassigned to the units, or soldiers who are coming out of the field getting ready to go home. This is the kind of people who be in these barracks there at 90th Replacement. And I know when I got there, they said, don't worry about it, we never get hit here. But, you know, they wouldn't lie to me anyway, would they? Anyway, this is kind of an idea of where there was no safe places. Now let's talk about the contrast of the Vietnamese people themselves. This is a beautiful village here. Amnon's getting all choked up over my slide presentation here. I wish he'd hurt and get well. And he was sick last time we were doing this. I tell you, he's got the can't help it. But this is a picture of a beautiful village. It's a Montagnard village in Central Highlands with the plants and so forth, and the mountains in the background. And the next picture is a typical Montagnard village. If you notice, all the houses are built up on stilts. That's so they have a place to put their livestock up under the house and keep them under and so forth. And also kind of helps slow down some of the varmints and so forth. And if you notice to the left a little bit, just about where that young man is standing, there's a longhouse there. That's where the community met, and everything kind of went around. It's just like the tribes of the American Indians you saw if you were from, whoever went to Cherokee, North Carolina, you saw that the Indians there didn't use teepees like we always thought all the Indians did. They were built wood and mud houses. Well, the Montagnards were very similar to the American Indians when we got there, and this is a Montagnard village. They do have a little bit of a fence around it, a wire fence around it to slow the tigers or whatever down. And the next one is the way they lived. These people in this boat here, in this community, it's a whole community there on the Benoit River, they lived on these boats. And they're not exactly what can be considered yachts by any means. But this is in Benoit. It's Benoit was right next to the 90th Replacement and Long Binh. Benoit was where big air base was. That we had Americans flying out of there too, but it was mostly South Vietnamese planes coming out of Benoit. And they lived on the boats, and there were actually places that were almost like shopping malls that are on the water. You got boats or barges out there, and you pull your boat up to, or your sampan up to those and buy your vegetables or whatever it is you want. But living full-time on the boats. Of course, you don't have a whole worry about sewage problems. You just kind of let everything hang over the side, which is interesting because sometimes you can see people dumping their, well, let's just say they're letting nature take its call on one side of the boat, and on the other side of the boat, there's probably somebody swimming, maybe somebody washing clothes, or even getting water out to cook. It's interesting to see the how much use they get out of that one little river right there. The next picture is going into the river, the Benoit River going into Benoit, and some of the traffic and so forth. Benoit wasn't that big of a town, but it was, as you can see from the high-rise building in there and so forth there. It was an important building because of being there with the air base and so forth. And you see the guy sitting on the rail right there. We called him the White Mice. That is a South Vietnamese policeman. And I know they did some good. I'm not certain what good they did, but they were the South Vietnamese policemen. We, like I said, we always call them the White Mouse. The next picture was a picture that I took right outside of Benoit Air Base, somewhere along about the Widows Village out of Long Binh. And as you notice there, you'd almost think about that as being something you see in Africa or someplace. Mud hut with a thatched roof right along the river there. That town was called, let's see, it was spelled just like Hanoi, but it was pronounced a different way. And because of my age, I forgot exactly how to pronounce it. So we're just going to go with the house. It's mud and thatched roof. The next one is interesting. This house has a tin roof. And if you look to the left of the picture, you'll see a little bit of a stand right there. That is for the Buddhists and their ancestors stand. They burn incense there. The Buddhists are extremely family-oriented, which created another problem for us in Vietnam in contrast. Somebody, again, in the military got up with the idea, let's take and move all these people from here and put them somewhere else. We'll give them a nice house. We'll give them the village and so forth. So then when something happens, we can go in there and bomb that area without the people being there. We don't have to worry about them being there because we're going to move them someplace else. So we may take their cows, pigs, chickens, everything else, the whole family, and put them 100 miles away. The problem was that the Buddhists are very ancestral, and they got to go back to where their ancestors are born. So that free fire zone all of a sudden becomes they're going back to that area, which we've been told by people in Washington, D.C. is a free fire zone. Anybody that moves in there is okay to shoot. But what you've got is some of these people are coming back and resettling their old house, which created many problems. And if you look at the little boy that's there, you will never see a Vietnamese child at the time who had a diaper. They just don't worry about diapers there. They just, well, anyway, we won't go into that a whole lot, but let's just say they don't use diapers and so forth. But that was a fairly nice house there. That guy must have had some money. And I still can't figure out the reason for this house. I know the monsoons come. And I know when the monsoons comes, it rains, and it rains hard. But I think after the first time, I would be smart enough to either put my house up on stilts like the Montagnards did or move it up a little bit higher out of the water. But this guy's going into his house, wading into his house. And if you notice behind, there's another person into the house there, goes right on the river. But I think I would have been smart enough to realize that maybe this is not where I should build my house during the monsoon season. Maybe it's kind of like those guys in New Orleans during the flood. But all right, the next house, this is one of my favorite houses. The next house has got clay tile shingles. But if you notice the walls of the house, what the walls are made out of is basically beer cans. If I remember correctly, I think it was Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. But Vietnamese people would take anything and make something out of it. And this guy took beer cans, which there was a lot of those are available, flattened them out, and nailed them to frames, and made his house out of beer cans. I bet it was exciting during the monsoon seasons when the rain hit it, but there they are with their clothes on the line. But I love this house, and I'm not certain what was behind the curtain there on his. It looks like it's a garage or something. No telling what was behind that, but I did enjoy the house out of beer cans. Okay, now we've talked about lifestyle a little bit. Let's talk about the bad guys. Depending on what part of Vietnam you were in, and what year you were there, depending on a great deal on who you fought. If you were up in I Corps, which was right on the dividing line between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and maybe even 2 Corps, the chances are if you fought there, it was going to be North Vietnamese Army. But most people would only think about the VC, or the Vietnamese Communist, or the Viet Cong. Because that's what the vast majority were when you see the newsreels and so forth. Now, the Vietnamese Communists were offshoots of the Viet Minh who fought the French and the Japanese and several others. But after World War II, when the Geneva Accords of 1954 was brought together, the powers that be, even though Ho Chi Minh had gone to them and said, let's Vietnam be run by Vietnamese. For hundreds of years, the French were there as a French colony, and the powers that be decided to give it back to the French, which didn't go over very well for the people of Vietnam who were nationalists and wanted Vietnam to be Vietnam by Vietnam, which was not very often because they were controlled by the Japanese, the Chinese, and just about everybody else over the period of time. So at the end of the war of World War II, and the Vietnamese Communists, or the Viet Minh, kind of went underground when the French came in, and eventually you've all heard of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where the Viet Minh came in and run the French out and so forth. By 1959, there were as many as 20 different untied together, basically, communist cells about 3,000 members altogether who were staunch communists. Were arrested of it. Most of the other people were nationalists and so forth. But so we run the French out, and then they just divided the country. They didn't really divide the country up. It was still one country, but they decided that part of it was going to be North Vietnam and it could be communist, but then in South Vietnam, they were going to have it democratic, and the idea was they were going to have an election and make it all one Vietnam. The problem was, part of it was the United States did not want all of Vietnam to become communist. So they in the South Vietnam kind of held off on the elections for a while because they were afraid that the elections were going to go communist, because there were still a lot of communists who had escaped or left South Vietnam, had gone up north, who were communists, and so a lot of them stayed back down and became the communist guerrillas and so forth. This next picture is a picture of some of the Viet Cong. Now, if you take those guns away from them and take their belts of ammunition off of them, how do you tell those guys from the bad guys? Some of them were farmers. Some of them did a little bit of everything, just like we do here. But how do you tell the good guys from the bad guys? You couldn't without a program. But that's what some of the Vietnamese communists look like. Now, during this period of time, the communists were claiming that in North Vietnam, claiming they had nothing to do with the communists in South Vietnam. The communists in South Vietnam were blowing things up, hotels, killing Americans, killing lots of Vietnamese, restaurants, just about any place they could come up with. Basically what they were trying to do is undermine the government of President Diem, who was somewhat corrupt on his own, but he was trying to bring a democracy to South Vietnam. But their idea was to disrupt everything that make his leadership look bad for the populace and so forth. So you had the communists going in, and even though North Vietnam was claiming they had nothing to do with it whatsoever, they were just friendly bystanders. It's pretty much been shown that they were supplying weapons and so forth. And on December 20th, 1960, the communist movement in South Vietnam was formalized and officially became the National Liberation Front. So the Viet Cong were officially called the National Liberation Front to liberate South Vietnam from whatever it was going to be liberated from. So many of the Viet Minh who had gone north came back down and became part of the National Liberation Front. And they say that the first words of the first person to call the communist, the VC, was actually by the president of South Vietnam, President Diem, and it was kind of a belittling the communists. It really didn't, even though the National Liberation Front, NFL, was what they were, he just kind of, they're just Vietnamese communists, like they were lesser people and so forth. So because they were there in South Vietnam and didn't have a whole lot of structure, they did kind of hide and blend in with the people there of South Vietnam, because they didn't have all the weapons. When they first started, they were basically using the weapons that we gave to them to fight the Japanese, which they in turn turned back around and to fight with the French, and now they're using those same weapons to fight us, which was somewhat older, but that didn't last long, because the North Vietnamese started supplying them with weapons, and eventually they had just the same weapons as everybody else had, AK-47 and so forth. And as you can see there, it was hard to tell them from anybody else, because during the day, the guy may be out working in his rice paddies and be a farmer, or he may be the guy in the restaurant or the bar you go into, or I remember the first time I got my hair cut in Vietnam. I'm sitting there, and the barber is taking his straight razor, and he's strapping it on that thing on the leather strap right there. And my first thing that came on my mind was, is he a good guy or a bad guy? And I'm here today, so evidently he was a good guy at that time. Of course, we during the Tet Offensive, we did lose a couple mama sons, and we felt like that they were good mama sons during the day, but they were Viet Cong, VC during the night, and they got killed during the battle and so forth. Basically, the Viet Cong, or the National Liberation Front, were divided up into three groups. Those were the regular forces. Those were guys who just like regular soldiers, except they did wear the black pajamas and the conical hats and so forth, who hid during the jungles and so forth. Then you had the full-time guerrillas. Now, the regular forces were basically manned and led by North Vietnam. Then you had the full-time guerrillas who were also pretty well supported by North Vietnam, but they were mostly controlled by the leadership in the South. And then you had the part-time Viet Cong and guerrillas, who were the farmers and so forth that were out during the day and so forth, who were there in the villages when you went in the village, and kind of kept an eye on so that the South Vietnamese people had a real problem in that whenever the American soldiers would go in, the American soldiers would give them a hard time because they'd help the VC. Now, the fact that there were VC in the village and some of their family were also conscripted by the VC, it was kind of hard for them not to help the VC. So then if they were friendly to the Americans, when the Americans left, the VC there in the village would turn back around and give them a hard time because they helped the Americans. So they were kind of caught in between there and so forth. Now, this next picture was the Viet Cong picture changed. There's a lot of history with the 1968 Tet Offensive. We call it the battle that lost the war. Even though we were winning the war, South Vietnam and the American government were winning the war. There were less and less problems with the Viet Cong. They played, and I always thought about this possibility that North Vietnam knew this was going to happen and sent them in to get killed and so forth. But a good part of the Tet Offensive of 1968 were the Viet Cong. And we killed a lot of Viet Cong during the Tet Offensive in about the first 2 or 3 weeks after the Tet. They were basically decimated as a fighting group. There were still a few of them there. North Vietnam actually had started bringing in the Army of North Vietnam to kind of subsidize the Viet Cong because there were so many of them killed. So you had the contrast of the Viet Cong guerrillas as a contrast to the NVA, which was the North Vietnamese Army. Their official title was the People's Army of Vietnam. Next picture. As you can see, they had uniforms just like the American soldiers. They probably weren't that nice and shiny and green and so forth when they were out in the jungle, just like our guys were out in rags. But they were well trained. They had weapons and marched. They had disciplined officers. They had everything that a normal army would be. They were, like I said, formerly they were known as the People's Army of Vietnam, or the PAVN, P-A-V-N. We call them the North Vietnamese Army, or NVA. They were regular forces, distinctive uniforms. They stayed in the northern part of South Vietnam and worked the Ho Chi Minh Trails. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was not just one trail. It was many trails where the supplies that the Viet Cong and the NVA needed were up and down the different trails and so forth. Most of those were going into Cambodia through Cambodia and Laos because, again, those people who were running the war decided that we couldn't bomb Laos or Cambodia and Ho Chi Minh Trail for a long time. But they had armor, artillery, armor, just like regular soldiers. They had the tanks. You can see the artillery there. They had the trucks like that for working the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They had airplanes also. Now, most of the airplanes stayed into North Vietnam. You did have the MiGs who would try to intercept the bombers and the fighters going into North Vietnam. Some of them were successful, some of them not, but they had airplanes but they did stay mostly north of the DMZ because they knew that they were not as good of pilots as they needed to be quite often, and they would get shot down because there was more Americans and so forth there. But people always think we lost the war, they say, to a ragtag bunch of farmers, and that's not what happened. We had the Viet Cong, and originally they were kind of ragtag, but by 64, 65, somewhere in that range, they were just guerrilla fighters, well trained and well equipped, as you can see from that. Now, we weren't just fighting North Vietnam, and South Vietnamese people were with us. China was a big supplier of rice and other. They sent 327 uniformed troops, 327,000 uniformed troops and several hundred thousand and setting up defense systems like the SAM missiles and the artilleries and so forth, and training and so forth, and lots of rice. The Soviet Union sent 55,000 advisors, kind of like we had originally sent in with the Special Forces advisors into South Vietnam, to install the air defenses and a lot of the electronic stuff, building, manning, and supporting the SAMs. And also Cuba sent in advisors. So we weren't just fighting the North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese had, like I said, their allies there. We had our allies. So it was not quite as sometimes as the news media put out that we were fighting the poor people, the poor communists of North Vietnam. There was a lot of other entities there. I know when I went back to Vietnam, I was talking to some of the Vietnamese people there, and after the fall of Saigon, and when the communists came in and took over, the Chinese government came in and they made Vietnam, by then it was the country of Vietnam, pay back all the rice and stuff they gave to them during the war. The people of North Vietnam almost starved right after the war, and Saigon fell at the end of the war, because almost everything they grew had to go back to China to help pay off that debt they had and so forth. Now, a lot of the news media came out and talked about the war. The Vietnam War was the first American defeat in war. That is not the truth. There was no defeat by the American government in war. The South was not defeated by revolutionary guerrillas running around in tire sandals, Ho Chi Minh sandals, dressed in black pajamas, carrying out homemade weapons. South Vietnam, who was sold out by the American Congress, which I'll get into a little bit, was overrun by a conventional army that consisted of 17 divisions and logistical support units. This army was trained and supplied by the Soviet Union and Red China, as I just mentioned. And we pulled out in 73. The South Vietnamese fought on well till 1975. Let's talk about some comparisons and contrast of the United States' involvement in other wars. This is not putting down any of the other wars as men who fought the other wars and so forth, just to kind of give you an idea of the contrast. During the American Civil War at the Battle of Bull Run, the Union Army broke and ran. The whole group just broke and ran. Nothing ever remotely like this ever happened in Vietnam. There was no unit ever broke and ran in Vietnam of the American forces there. In World War II in the Philippines, 2 U.S. generals surrendered their entire group of men they were fighting for. You see the famous Bataan Death March and the famous POW prisons and so forth at the thing. In Vietnam, there was no generals who surrendered or surrendered all their people by the hundreds of thousands as in World War II. While in World War II in the European theater, there were 20,000 U.S. military men who were convicted of desertion. 20,000 people. This was the war that was supposed to be the end of wars, and everybody found out when we went to war, everybody was supposed to went out and join. Well, it's not quite the way it was. Only 5,000 men assigned to Vietnam deserted, And of the men that assigned to Vietnam, there was only 249 of those deserted while they were in Vietnam. Desertions during World War II were 55% higher than in Vietnam. That's some pretty good contrast from what we were told by the news media and so forth. In the Korean War, the 1st Marine Division was driven from the Chosin Reservoir and forced into evacuation when they were joined by other U.S. and South Korean forces at the Korean port of Hungman. 150,000 United States and Allied forces were evacuated to keep them from being wiped out. In Vietnam, there was never a massive evacuation of U.S. or South Vietnamese or Allied military. There was never a time that everybody had to get out but keep from getting massacred. In World War II, 66% of the troops were drafted. Now that's not what history has always said. History's always said, hey, we went as soon as the United States declared war, everybody dropped what they were doing and just the line waiting to get in to join. Not quite that way. In Vietnam, only 25% of the military served in Vietnam were draftees. That means 75% of everybody who went to Vietnam volunteered for Vietnam one way or the other. Not quite the contrast that we were always taught. During World War II, talking about POWs, to give you a little bit more contrast, there was 130,000 odd people, men and women captured during the World War II. Men and women were put into prison camps. In Korea, the Americans captured was 7,140. But during the Vietnam War, there were 771 of those POWs. Now, of those, over 500 and some of those were due to being shot down by SAM missiles, anti-aircraft guns over North Vietnam. You remember North Vietnam, where our government told the Swiss government, says the Americans are going to bomb this at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, just so you can get the people out. Well, they knew we were coming, so they were all set up, and they shot down a lot of American airplanes, which is why we had over 500 and some prisoners of war who were in the Navy or Air Force, where they were shot down. Now let's talk about another one of my favorite things is the media of Vietnam. In 1969, Life magazine featured an article published in the portrait of 250 men who were killed in a typical week in Vietnam. Not quite certain what a typical week was, but they decided this was a typical week. Now, the idea of doing this was to illustrate the Vietnam tragedy, the tragedy of the United States being in Vietnam. But why didn't they do it at the same time in 1969? The average deaths in a week from traffic deaths was 1,082. If it was so important to show how many people were dying, why didn't they show the deaths from traffic, just like they showed deaths from the war? Maybe it was safer to be over in Vietnam during the war than it was to be back on the streets of the United States, when you look at it that way. Now, this is another one of my favorite because I've been to Khe Sanh a couple of times. Recently, I was not there as a Marine. In 1968, Newsweek showed the Marines at Khe Sanh, and they showed them dug into holes and so forth, and that bright red clay, and always showed them hunkered down as the artillery rounds were coming in and from the communists were shooting artillery at them. You always showed them that. It never once showed the Marines fighting back. They were always hunkered down almost like rats in the holes trying to hide from those mean old communists, but it never actually showed them fighting back. But in reality, for every shell that was shot into Khe Sanh by the communists, the Americans shot 10 more than they did. The United States Marines lost 205 men during Khe Sanh, which is a lot of men. It was a 77-day siege. But the communists lost 15,000. But even today, if you look at some of the history books and news media, we lost the battle at Khe Sanh. In fact, if you go to Khe Sanh today, be sure and go to the museum, because to make a long story short, when Khe Sanh was over with and it was no longer a battlefield, the Marines pulled out and the Army came in and took their place. Now, if you go to the museums at Khe Sanh, the communist museums at Khe Sanh, they have pictures of the Marines with their duffel bags getting on the helicopters, and the caption of those were the Marines are escaping from Khe Sanh. The reason they were leaving from Khe Sanh was because the Army had taken over. So that exactly, it's kind of what you wanted to say. Not that the media would do that. Now let's just talk about a while ago when I made a comment about the United States Congress doing a number on South Vietnam and the men and women of America who went in, contrasting it with and comparing it with other wars that we fought. Congress passed the Chase-Church Amendment in 1973. It forbade U.S. naval forces from the seas even surrounding Vietnam. It forbade U.S. ground forces from operating in Vietnam. It kept the Air Force from flying anywhere over Southeast Asia. It forbade all aid as far as medical aid, humanitarian aid, everything. They gave South Vietnam not a single dollar or bullet was allowed to go in. Now during that same period of time, from 1974 to April 1975 is when Saigon fell. The Soviet Union and Red China supplied over 832,000 tons of war materials to Vietnam. South Vietnam was getting nothing. They were having to take 5 or 6 helicopters and take the parts off it just to get one helicopter they could fly. When Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam, fell in April 1975, there were 700 Soviet tanks leading that charge. The United States Congress supplied South Vietnam nothing. They had completely turned their backs on our friends and our allies of South Vietnam altogether. Now, during that time, the U.S. Navy was protecting Taiwan from China. The U.S. had 500,000 troops in South Korea to make sure that the Chinese didn't come over the DMZ. We had 300,000 troops in Europe, making sure the Russians didn't come over. The U.S. had an ironclad guarantee that if the communist forces crossed any Cold War lines, the DMZ in Korea or the Iron Curtain in Europe, there would be unlimited reaction from the United States forces up to and including nuclear response. Now, we had an agreement with all these other countries that we would do whatever it took to protect them and their sovereign rights. But our government walked off and left our good friends of South Vietnam, which is why South Vietnam is today communist. That's some pretty good comparisons and contrasts between our government, where they treated our allies, depending on maybe was it the shape of their eyes? I'm not certain what the difference was. Vietnam was a long ways away by people who had religions and we didn't understand. I'm not certain what it all was, but our government basically threw them to the wolves. Now let's talk about why they did that. The draft dodgers and anti-war movement, that was going on strong. Now, the fact has been proven that the draft dodgers and anti-war movement was not that they were so interested in the war in Vietnam. They were more interested in, don't send my tail to Vietnam, because I don't want to go. I might get killed. I might get a leech. So you'll find, if you go back and look doing the statistics, when the United States went from a draft to a lottery, a lot of the war protesters dropped off because during the draft, you were signed up with your local draft board. Unless your daddy had a whole lot of money and could buy someone else to take your place at the draft board, you had a good chance of being drafted. It wasn't exactly a fair system. But when went to the lottery, all you had to do was see that your birthday came up on a high number. If you came up in the 200s, you could go out and party because you knew your chances of you going to Vietnam were very good. So after the lottery came in, a lot of the protesters dropped off. And in 1972, when Congress entered the draft, it was hard to find war protesters. Now, some people say, well, they protested because their conscience said the war was wrong and their conscience. Well, why were they carrying North Vietnamese flags, Chinese flags, Russian flags, and burning American flags? Were they supporting the communists, or were they United States citizens whose conscience said that we shouldn't be fighting there? Seems more like they're supporting the communists rather than they are supporting their own country. I just saying, that's just me. I'm saying that it may not have been that way. Yeah. Maybe the American experience in Vietnam and its ongoing attention and legacy even today is because of many contrasts in the war and the people of the United States and its government not understanding those contrasts. As I mentioned a while ago, religion and so forth. Was it the fact that the Vietnam War was the first real war brought into your on your television? You could sit down in your living room and watch the war. Of course, now you only watch the war of what the news media wanted you to see. You never saw the American soldiers going into the orphanages or the American soldiers, medics going in into the villages and take care. All you saw was the bad things. It goes back to, if it bleeds, it leads, that news media has come up with. So we saw all the bad parts of the war, and there's a lot of bad parts of the war because war is terrible, but there's also good parts of what the American soldier does. We've always taken care of the kids wherever we were. So the fact that it was also all of a sudden brought into our TV, by TV and so forth, was that when you read an article, like the article from Life magazine, about these people who were killed in Vietnam as opposed to the people who were killed in, which they didn't mention, the traffic and so forth, was it the media, how they selected their stories and the pictures and articles on the war? Was that have something to do with it? Was it the draft dodgers and the anti-war movement and their actions? Was it the lies and mistruths that came about of the men and women who fought in the war? I don't think there's ever been a war ever fought that there was so many lies and so forth. The misfacts of there were more black soldiers killed in Vietnam than proportionally than whites. That has been disproven. The population of the black men and women and children of the United States was about 11.5% during that time. And the deaths of soldiers in Vietnam was about 11.5%. Now, I will tell you that in the beginning, because a lot of the career soldiers were the black man, because that was a way to get ahead, were in the military, and they were dying disproportionately, but by the end of the war, it was pretty well balanced, just like the thing. Was it something to do with the civil rights that was going on? This country was in a lot of turmoil. We had the civil rights movements going on. We had voting rights movement. We had women's rights, burning their bras. We had drugs that were getting more and more open. The hippies. Somebody was telling me the other day, was asking me about the hippies. They were offshoot of all these movements. Was it rock and roll music? I mean, I remember when it first got started, it was something from the devil. And so forth, and people trying to stop people from swerving. I mean, when Elvis Presley first went on the Ed Sullivan show, they only showed him was waist up. They wouldn't show him down below because he always danced and twisted and turned and contorted and so forth. So they wouldn't even show him because he was one of them rock and roll people. At that time, the American people started all of a sudden going, I'm not certain my government's doing the right thing. They started questioning the authority. Again, the war was from people we didn't understand. Their skin was a different color than ours. They had religions that we didn't know anything about, all kinds of religions. Is that something to do with the fact they were so far away? This next picture, I think, all the comparisons and so forth. I love this one over here. Girls say yes to boys who say no. That's the boys who say no to going to Vietnam. And then we have a picture of President Kennedy talking about Vietnam. And then, of course, the famous picture of the little girl running down the street who was burned by napalm. Now, for a long time, those mean old guys from the United States military were out burning these children. Well, the United States had nothing to do with this young lady. She now is no longer a young lady. She's a very healthy young lady. Her name is something, but she lives in Canada and she travels around making a living now speaking about being in this picture. But actually, the American soldiers are the one that picked her up and took her to the aid station to save her life. Now, the next picture, you see the part of the civil rights and the black movement. That actually is a comment that Muhammad Ali or Cassius Clay made. And of course, the famous picture of the colonel doing Tet, shooting the guy in the head, and literally the TV. You could be sitting down at your dinner table doing this episode, and actually see the guy with a bullet coming out of his head, which I know was really good, depending on what you're eating there. But it really didn't tell you the reason for this. And the guy who took this picture actually came up and apologized to the colonel for taking the picture. He said that picture ruined the colonel's life and probably had a lot to do with the bringing about the end of the war too. But he, even to the day he died, he apologized for the colonel, because this guy was one of the colonel's best friends, and he just got through killing a bunch of the colonel's people and their families as a Viet Cong. And of course, then you got the end the war, bring the troops home. And what you didn't see is the soldiers who loved the kids, who went into orphanages. Here's a soldier carrying an elderly lady. And of course, there is the Vietnam Wall, the offset and what came out of the conflict. And if you see the man in the wheelchair, he's definitely proving that freedom is not free. And of course, there's the famous picture of Jane sitting there waiting for the blue-haired, blue-eyed murderers. And there's a couple sitting down in their living room watching that war on TV. Those were the contrast of all that was going on. I hope you've enjoyed this show, talking about the contrast and the comparisons. There were lots of them in Vietnam, depending on what kind of job you had, the years you were there, who you were fighting, the contrast between the South Vietnamese people. There was either a wealthy class or there was a poor class, most of the poor class. There was very little middle class during the Vietnam War, but a lot of people in Vietnam were making lots of money and so forth from the war and lived very well, government officials and so forth. And then you compare and contrast how our government fought the Vietnam War and how they backed and fought the other wars. This just kind of touches the tip of the iceberg of the contrast and comparisons of other wars. I recommend you go out and don't take anything I've said or shown you here. Go out, do some research on your own. And I think you'll find that everything I said here had truth to it. There was just so many things that come out of the Vietnam War that was not true. It's hard to pick out the contrast and comparisons unless you were there and do a lot of research. And when you do research, don't go to one website and look at it. I know when I was doing the thing on the black soldiers in Vietnam, I had websites that showed me that were written probably in the 60s, the articles, which are, I know the internet wasn't there, but articles, and they said one thing, then you don't go to the next page and it said something totally different. Do your research. And by the way, we're coming up on an election pretty soon. We got one coming up March 15th, which is the day of the symposium. Pay attention to what's going on in your world. Go out there and vote. And looking forward to seeing you next show. The next show will be talking about Agent Orange and getting your claims done. If you remember when we did the show on Agent Orange, Tony out of Wilmington was a veteran service officer who was a fantastic veteran service officer. He's going to be doing the show again, giving you lots of good information. Looking forward to seeing you in 2 weeks when we do the show. Have a good one. Enjoy March Madness, and thank you for tuning in.
You're tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. Our weekly lineup of call-in programs includes Computers 2K Now with Amnon Nissan, My Life, My Will with Gisela DiCarlo, The Tanya Love Show, Health Then with Debbie Bruck, Breaking Free with Marilyn Shannon, Triangle Be Well with Howard Jacobson, Lunch and Learn with Rabbi Yisrael Cutler, Lessons of Vietnam with NCVVI members, Parent Dome with Ryan Miller, Current Affairs with Amnon Nissan. And if you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.